Hey, how's it going? It's been a while since I've done one of these solo videos, so I figured I'd start because we are getting to a key moment insofar as this conflict in Ukraine. Because two things are going on. Okay, number one, the Russians seem to be about to take Bakhmut, and the Zelensky regime, the Kiev regime, has invested just about, it's thrown everything at Bakhmut, because Bakhmut, regardless of what the mainstream media might be telling you, is a key supply line. It's a key crossroads of multiple roads and multiple train lines. It's crucial. And it's really the penultimate line of defense. And the final line of defense is much weaker than the Bakhmut line. So this is key, and the Kiev regime is throwing everything it can into Bakhmut. And the key issue, they are having to pull out reserves from other places on the front, and the Russians are taking advantage of that. In Zaporozhye, towards the city of Zaporozhye, the Russians, as of yesterday, had advanced something like 10 kilometers, which is a big, big deal in this static front that's been going on for the last few months. And so what's happening is that the Russians are able to advance at Zaporozhye because the troops that were there, the reserves to plug that line there, had to be pulled to support Bakhmut. So, you see what's going on. It's like a dam. The dam is like breaking, and there are multiple holes and not enough fingers to plug in all the holes. And so the West realizes this. Everybody who has good intel on what's actually going on, and not the nonsense propaganda of the mainstream media, they recognize that Bakhmut is the key battle of the war. And the Russians are winning. And it's not merely that they're going to take Bakhmut, they are drawing forces away from the other areas of the line. Okay, if you look at a map, Zaporozhye is a couple hundred kilometers to the east from Bakhmut, or more. I think it's like 300. It doesn't matter. The point is that the Zelensky regime is having to pull troops there, weakening that line, allowing the Russians to advance and potentially capture the city of Zaporozhye, which is a big deal. It used to be a city of 700,000 people. And so you see what's going on. We're coming to the end. Okay? If this is a chess match, this is the Endgame, and the result is already known. We already know more or less who's going to win, right? The West, the Western warmongers, they know who's going to win. So all of a sudden there's this talk about sending tanks and sending F-16s and all kinds of stuff. And a lot of people in the Western military don't want to be sending their gear, because if they send the gear, they're not going to have any gear. And they also recognize a few things that I think most people don't seem to realize, which is, number one, the people operating these tanks, the Bradley fighting vehicles, the Leopard 2 tanks, whatever, it's not going to be operated by Ukrainian troops. There's simply not enough time to train them. You need 6 months to 12 months to train people to operate this gear effectively, okay? So number one, that gear is going to have to be operated by NATO troops, number one. Number two, on its own, this armor isn't going to do a hell of a lot, okay? Because you see, in military, in industrial warfare, in combined arms, it's in the term, combined arms warfare, you have tanks and aircraft and air defense systems and artillery and everything working in conjunction to achieve a military objective. It's not just, oh, we're losing, oh, let's throw more tanks and we'll win. No, it doesn't work that way. You have to throw in tanks and aircraft and this and that, and all together operating so as to achieve the military goal. And so throwing some armor isn't really going to help. But the other thing that they're talking about are sending planes. Yeah, the sending planes. Because, the tanks that they're talking about sending, they amount to a couple of hundred, a few hundred. Now, each of these tanks or fighting vehicles or whatever needs a crew of 2, 3, 4, 5 guys, some of them, right? And so that's several hundred NATO troops. Because, like I said, there isn't enough time to train Kiev regime forces to operate this gear. So it would have to be NATO troops. or NATO contractors, which is really, they were NATO troops yesterday, and today they resigned their commission and signed a contract with a private military contracting firm and hopped into their tanks and drove off to Ukraine. I mean, that's basically what we're talking about. It's NATO troops. Don't kid yourself. So it would be several hundred and perhaps several thousand NATO troops, freshly minted PMCs, who are going to be operating this gear. Okay? And so wouldn't it be better, easier to use aircraft? Because after all, an aircraft just has one guy in the pilot's seat. Of course, it has logistical support and all the rest of it, but that's not the point. The point is that, see, if they gave aircraft, and I personally think that that's where this conflict is going, an air war. Because a lot of these idiots who are in Brussels and Washington, they think that, how can I put it? They think that if they throw in a few chips here and there, they can somehow win. They can turn it all around, okay? Now, when you go to the casino and you're playing at a roulette table, yeah, sure, if you happen to throw in like $5 on number 29 and it pays out, 35 to 1, yeah, sure, then you can recover all that you lost before. But that doesn't happen in a war now, does it? Because a war isn't a roulette table. A war is, for lack of a better term, a very scientific mathematical process. Andrei Martyanov always is talking about this, that it's all about math. It's all about calculus, and you thought that calculus would be useless. No, if you go to war, now you know what to study. Okay, but anyway, I'm just kidding aside. See, the fools in Brussels and in Washington who thought that they could break the Russians fairly easily, break their economy fairly easily, and discovered to their regret that they could not. Now they're panicking. Now they're realizing that the Zelensky regime is collapsing militarily. The fact that all of a sudden these weird movements are going on in Kiev itself, with Arestovich gone, the interior minister and his 2 deputies being killed in a helicopter crash, that nobody knows what happened. I mean, there are suspicions, but let's leave that aside for now. The point is that there is this sense in the West and in Kiev that it's winding down, it's coming to the end, okay? Because if the Zelensky regime holds on to Bakhmut, the Russians are going to break through at Zaporozhye. If they try to plug in Zaporozhye, the Russians are going to break through in Bakhmut. And even if by some magic they're able to hold the line at both Zaporozhye and Bakhmut, that would mean withdrawing forces from other places along the lines, other places where the Russians can break through. It's over. And so the West is panicking, and the West is talking about sending tanks, and all of a sudden they're talking about sending aircraft. But at the same time, what's going on is that there's a lot of infighting in the West. The Germans are saying, we won't send our Leopard 2 tanks unless you Americans send your Abrams tanks. And then the Dutch are saying, we'll send F-16s, but only if you guys send your F-16s. I mean, you see what's going on. Alexander Mercouris, in yesterday's video that he put out, which is excellent as usual, he pointed out, he thought that it was positioning of a lot of people for the blame game. And he thought that maybe it was even on a subliminal level that they're positioning themselves for the blame game because they fundamentally know what's to come. It could be. It could be that they want to figure out how to lay the blame on somebody else. And Alexander was of the opinion that everybody was going to blame the Germans, Olaf Scholz and whatnot. Maybe. I mean, we'll see that episode when we get to it, because in this particular Mexican soap opera, all kinds of crazy stuff happens episodes to episode, right? But right now, in this episode, where we're at this time, okay, it seems that there are basically 2 roads. One road is the Zelensky regime continues doing what it's doing, and it fails. The Russians finally break through, and all of a sudden, there's a general military collapse of the Kiev regime forces. That's one road. And the West is just standing by, watching, crying, all kinds of bullshit, but essentially able to do nothing. That's one path. The other path is that NATO gets involved directly, just really takes over this war. And I've always thought that the easiest way for them to do it is not by tanks, not by sending thousands of operators to operate these tanks and whatnot with an incredibly long supply chain. I mean, do keep in mind, all this equipment has to be maintained. It needs a huge support structure to keep these fighting vehicles and tanks operating, right? And you'd have to move these tanks back and forth across this huge country because remember, Ukraine is huge. It's the size of France, the size of Texas, right? And so why not air war, they would think. Air war. Declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Or at least a no-fly zone over a piece of Ukraine, a big piece of it. You know, Western Ukraine or something. Who knows? It doesn't matter. But get involved that way. And of course, what will happen is that the Russians will shoot down a lot of these F-16s, and this will be the excuse to, once again, double down on their bets. More aircraft, not F-16s, but F-35s and F-22s, and really ramp it up and go for a head-to-head war between NATO and Russia. You see? I personally am unsure which path is going to be taken. Either, there's a clear military loss and things start to collapse in the Kiev regime, which is what we are seeing. It's beginning to collapse. The rats are leaving the ship. Arestovich has been giving all kinds of crazy-ass interviews. I mean, the guy seems to have a death wish because, a lot of Ukrainians and a lot of very nasty Ukrainians will probably want to kill him for the stuff he's been saying over the last few days, right? That's typical behavior of rats leaving a sinking ship. And so in Kiev, they're aware that the situation is collapsing, okay? Certainly on the battlefield, as I explained before, we're coming to the end. And it could be that NATO, the Western countries, just watch this, wring their hands, and pretty much do nothing, which would be the best outcome, quite frankly, because it would minimize loss of life. Because my interest in this entire conflict has always been the same. I'm in favor of minimizing destruction and loss of life. That's my motto. That's my North Star. I don't really care who wins. The Ukrainians win, the Russians win. I don't give a shit. Quite frankly, I don't. Because I don't have a dog in this fight, a pony in this race. As far as I'm concerned, what we want is long-lasting peace with minimization of destruction and loss of life. And so if the Kiev regime's military collapses, as it seems inevitable, if the Kiev regime itself collapses and the Russians sweep in and take over the whole country while the West just throws up its hands and throws a little hissy fit but effectively does nothing, that would actually be the best outcome. And I don't mean this, as like an anti-Ukraine or pro-Russian. No, it would minimize the loss of life, minimize destruction of the country. Okay? That would be the best outcome. But I'm terrified that the warmongers in NATO and the United States, they don't want that. They don't want this to end. There's something else that people don't seem to realize. When you get into a conflict like this, when the gloves are finally off, right, you get a high. Because before, you're kind of like tiptoeing around, trying to achieve some objective in a passive-aggressive way, right? It's extremely frustrating because things don't go your way. But if you finally, just take off the gloves and start beating each other senseless, there's a relief, a satisfaction that finally we can just take the gloves off and just go, man. It's human nature, human psychology, call it what you will. People love clarity. People love the ability to just take off the gloves and go for it. Why do you think that there are, street fights and bars and shit? Because, people all of a sudden say, fuck it, let's just go. And they beat each other up senseless, right? And over what? Over some waffle at a Waffle House or some nonsense, or because they didn't get the sandwich that they wanted, right? It's human nature. And so maybe, and this is my fear, that NATO, the West, the Americans, figure that let's just take the gloves off. Let's use air power, We don't need hundreds or perhaps thousands of operators. No, we just need pilots. And we pretend that they're Ukrainian pilots operating these F-16s, and of course they're not. And they fly in from Poland, from Germany, and bomb the shit out of the Russians in Ukraine, or so they think. because that's what they're thinking. That with this air power, they can just dominate, which is foolish, it's stupid. It's not understanding the reality of industrial warfare, but they're thinking that they use F-16s and they go in there and just really do it to the Russians. And if they lose some F-16s, then they put in the F-35s, and then they put in the F-22s, because we're America, number one, yeah, we got the best military in the world, huh? Yeah, the best woke military. What are your pronouns again, Colonel? But you see my point. That's a very serious point, and no kidding around. We are at an inflection point. We are at an inflection point where it is going to be either the collapse of the Zelensky military and the Zelensky regime itself in short order over this winter into the spring, or the West starts really putting in air power, loses it to Russian air defenses, and then doubles down. And it becomes even worse, and it quickly escalates. The next few weeks are really crucial, and it's really going to be a political game. It'll be a political game as to whether the military in the West, which knows they are under no illusions as to their ability to match the Russians on the battlefield, if they are able to rein in the foolish civilians who want to increase and widen this war, escalate this war. And people like Victoria Nuland and Anthony Blinken, the people in the Biden administration, they're all for escalation, of course. That's what they've been doing, doubling down time and time again, and fruitlessly. Every time they double down, it paradoxically hurts them, the West, and somehow, weirdly, in this bizarre way, it makes the Russians stronger. That is something that was not in their calculations, but that's what's happening. And so now, in the frustration over the last 10, 11 months, know what's going on.